Hello, this is Francesca Vigliani from Cloud Academy. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today we're going to talk about how to master the Microsoft Azure AZ-300 and AZ-301 exams. Let me introduce you to our Azure and Google Cloud Content Lead, Guy Hamill, and our Azure researcher and trainer, Thomas Mitchell. Our experts will show you how to prepare for the latest Azure exams on our platform. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Over to you, Guy.
Thanks, Francesca. Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people joining us today. It's obviously a lot of interest in Microsoft's new Solution Architect exams. So here's what we're going to cover today. We'll start off with an overview of the certification, and then go over the benefits of getting the certification, what to expect on the exams, like what types of questions you'll get, the topics you need to know for the exams, the learning paths that we have at Cloud Academy to help you prepare for the exams, give you a quick demo of that, and then just a few quick exam tips, and then we'll do a question and answer session. Okay, so the Azure Solutions Architect certification was released on January 1st of this year, so it's still very new. Oops, sorry. You need to pass two exams, the AZ-300 and AZ-301 exams. These replace the 7535 exam. And if you did pass that exam, then there's a transition exam called AZ-302, where you could just take that exam and not have to take the AZ-300 or 301 exams at all. But that transition exam is only available until June 30th, so not for very much longer. If you pass the earlier 7534 exam, which 535 replaced, then you still have to take the AZ-300 and 301 exams. So that's a lot of numbers. I'll just move on from there. This is a role-based certification. So Microsoft's customers told them that their previous exams were too broad. People were expected to know way too much for the exam, way more than they would need to know in their actual jobs. And so Microsoft overhauled their certifications and made them very focused on job roles. So for example, they have one for administrators, and it only asks questions about topics that a typical administrator would need to know. So Microsoft has exams for administrators, developers, architects, DevOps, and security engineers. And it looks like they have more coming as well. So this is a really big rollout that they've done this year with new certifications. The architect certification is at the expert level. And the only other one that's at the expert level is the DevOps engineer, at the moment anyway. All the other ones are at the associate level. However, there are no prerequisites before you take AZ-300 or 301. You don't have to take any associate level exams or anything like that. You can just move on straight to this one if you want to. There is actually a fair bit of overlap between what's in the architect level exams and the administrator exams. They're actually, they do have a lot in common. So if you had the administrator ones, it would help a lot in preparing for this one. Okay, so the requirements. Now this comes straight off of the page for this certification. Candidates should have advanced experience and knowledge across various aspects of IT operations, including networking, virtualization, identity, security, business continuity, disaster recovery, data management, budgeting, and governance. And candidates must be proficient in Azure administration, Azure development, and DevOps, and have expert level skills in at least one of those domains. Now, considering what I just said about Microsoft slimming everything down so that they're not covering so many broad topics for these role-based certifications, this seems to be a contradiction. And really, it is a contradiction. The architect exams are not any smaller than they were before. In fact, I would say that the 300 and 301 exams cover more topics than the 535 exam did. So the reason for this is that the architect exam, which is an expert level exam, covers practically everything there is in Azure at a high level. Architects do need to know almost everything there is to know in Azure at a high level. And so these are still very broad exams, and they're quite difficult, I'll warn you. these are not easy exams. Okay, the associate level exams do cover a lot less material than these ones do, but this one is still big. So hopefully I haven't scared you too much, because there are lots of benefits to getting this certification. So first of all, it proves that you can architect a wide range of Azure solutions. And this is particularly valuable for Microsoft partners and consultants, because when they're going to potential customers and portraying themselves as being experts, it's nice for them to have some kind of proof of that. And having the certification definitely helps with that. It also helps employers evaluate candidates when they're interviewing. So you don't have to get the certification to get a job as an architect doing Azure work, but I would say it definitely helps if you've got two candidates who have more or less the same level of experience, and one of them has a certification and one doesn't, then that could give them the edge in getting the job. Another possibility is that you could validate that all your team members have the same base level of Azure knowledge. So we actually see this all the time, because we'll have customers come to us at Cloud Academy and say, we're making the big move to Azure, and we've got this big team here, and we need to make sure that all of them have a decent level of Azure knowledge. And so we take them through our learning paths, help prepare them for the exam or exams, and they take those, get certified, and then they know that everybody on the team has at least the same base level of Azure knowledge. Now, what to expect on the exam? So there are typically between 40 and 60 questions. It does vary a bit, but it's usually somewhere in there. They give you 2.5 hours to do the exam. Now, the types of questions, as you would expect, they do have multiple choice questions, quite a few of them, but they also have lots of other types too. So one of them is true-false questions. And you might think, why on earth would they have true-false questions on these exams? That would be too easy. But these are actually not easy. What they do is they give you a scenario. So they'll say, okay, you've got this situation, there's a problem that you're trying to solve. Would this solution be an appropriate solution for this problem? And then you just say yes or no. And then you move on to the next question, and it says, okay, same scenario, how about this solution? And then they give you a different solution, and you have to say whether that one would work or not. And then you start to doubt yourself a little bit. And you think maybe what you answered on the previous question wasn't right, that this is actually a better solution. But they don't allow you to go back to the previous question. So you can't go back and change your answer. And then you move on to the next question, and then they ask you again, right? So they typically do this 3 times. And they're a lot more difficult than it seems. Then there's drag and drop questions, where they have a bunch of blanks on the screen, and then you have to drag things into those blanks. So an example would be, they'll give you let's say a PowerShell command, a long PowerShell command, and then they'll remove pieces of it and have some blanks in there. And then they'll give you pieces of code that you can drop into those blanks. And similar to that is sometimes they use drop-down menus. So it'll be kind of like that with the drag and drop, except that you're choosing from some options that they have in drop-down menus. And quite often the drop-downs, they'll have multiple of them on the screen, and they'll quite often have different things to choose from in each one of the drop-downs. So it's similar to the drag and drop, but it's a little bit different. And then the dreaded case studies. So with a case study, they give you a lot of information about a particular scenario, about a company that's going to migrate to Azure or something like that. And so there's a lot of reading that you need to do. And then they ask you a series of questions that are all related to that case. And then recently they've added live labs as well. So this is where you would actually go into Azure and perform real live tasks. Okay, so in the past, you could probably get away with just studying everything and not getting any hands-on experience before you take the exam, and you might be able to pass that way. But now you actually have to be able to do it in Azure. So you really do need hands-on experience to pass these exams. They might have other types of questions as well. They didn't used to have live labs, and they added them recently. So they do change things fairly frequently on these exams. But the bottom line is that there are lots of different types of questions. And so these are not just straightforward, multiple choice questions all the way through. All right, so now I am going to hand it over to Tom. And Tom is going to tell you about the AZ300 exam and what skills you need to know for that exam.
The exam itself is actually heaviest on deploying and configuring infrastructure, while being pretty light on other things like deploying apps and implementing authentication. Now, with that said, let's get into some detail on what the AZ300 actually covers. As far as storage goes, the AZ300 is going to test your overall understanding of Azure storage as well as your ability to deploy storage solutions. What it's going to do is test your ability to secure Azure storage as well as your ability to integrate Azure storage with other solutions. You're going to be expected to know how to provision storage accounts based on specific requirements and how to provide access to data that is stored in those storage accounts that are provisioned. As far as VMs go, you're likely to encounter a few questions that are related to VM deployment and how to make VMs highly available. So you'll need to know the difference between availability sets versus availability zones. You'll also need to know how to load balance VMs. In addition to understanding these HA concepts, for example, how to deploy them, how to configure them, you'll also be expected to know how to automate VM deployment using strategies such as VHD templates and even some ARM templates. VM scale sets are also a topic that the AZ300 may touch on. So it's pretty important that you know what a scale set is and what it does. Obviously, you should know how to configure one as well. Now, virtual networking is another objective that the AZ300 exam hits pretty hard. So be sure that you have a good understanding of how to deploy virtual networks and virtual subnets before you sit the exam. You should also make sure that you know how to connect networks using things like site-to-site VPNs, VNet peering, even ExpressRoute for that matter. Be sure that you understand the components that make up things like site-to-site VPN. This would include things like virtual network gateways, gateway subnets, VPN connections, and local network gateways. You might find yourself dealing with a live lab, and believe me, the live labs can be difficult. You'd be dealing with a live lab on the exam that asks you how to connect two different networks using any one of these solutions. And not only is it going to ask you how, it's going to make you do it. If you're real lucky, you might even see a lab that asks you to connect multiple networks with more than one of these methods. So make sure you're well versed in Azure VNets and with the ability to connect them. Now, in addition to the networking, AZ300 is also likely to get into some Azure Active Directory a bit. You may see questions or case studies, and maybe even a live lab that expects you to perform specific identity-related tasks within Azure AD. That said, you're going to want to be sure that you know how to do things like deploy Azure AD Connect, how to configure multi-factor authentication, maybe how to set up single sign-on for end users, and you might even want to brush up on other things like self-service password reset. There's quite a bit that goes on regarding security. Now, any case studies or live labs that you encounter in this AZ300 exam are going to target real-world skills. I mean, that's the whole purpose for them. That said, you should know how to complete real-world tasks, such as I mentioned earlier, connecting on-prem networks to Azure VNets, or how to use, for example, Azure Site Recovery to migrate on-prem servers to Microsoft Azure. These are real-world skills that you're probably going to run into on some of these labs. You should also make sure that you think about load balancing and how you can use it to improve performance and availability for applications and VMs. Other real-world stuff that you're likely to encounter include multi-factor authentication and RBAC. So before sitting this exam, be sure that you know how to configure multi-factor authentication, or MFA, and how to provide access to Azure resources using RBAC, or role-based access control. Now, while the exam objectives for AZ300 are rather light as far as app creation and deployment go, you should probably make sure that you familiarize yourself with the Azure App Service as well as the Azure Container Service. Be sure that you brush up on things like Kubernetes and Docker in case something about them pops up on the exam. As far as authentication and security topics go, be sure that you understand what managed identities are and what role they play. You should also familiarize yourself with Azure Key Vault, because if you think about it, Microsoft is not likely to publish an exam that leaves out these two important security features. I can't imagine you're going to get through this exam without needing to answer at least a few questions on these specific topics. Now, while most of the other topics that are covered by AZ300 relate to infrastructure and identity, the exam does cover some development content. Although I don't think you're going to need to be an expert on things like Event Grid or Service Bus and stuff like that, you're probably going to encounter some questions that test your knowledge of their basic functionalities and features. So if you haven't familiarized yourself with things like Notification Hub or Relay Service or any of those other services that I've mentioned, it's probably a good idea that you sit down and review that information before you sit the exam. So now that you know a little bit about what to expect from the AZ300 exam, let me hand it back over to Guy so he can tell you a little bit about the AZ301 exam.
All right, thanks, Tom. The AZ301 exam is more about concepts and designs. So it doesn't really go into specific Azure services. If you look at the exam guide for 301, it mentions these high-level concepts, and it doesn't really get into the specific Azure services like AZ300 did. So, but as we go through this, I'll tell you what some of the actual services are that you would use putting these designs together. So this one is split into 6 different areas. Determine workload requirements, design for identity and security, design a data platform solution, design a business continuity strategy, design for deployment, migration, and integration, and design an infrastructure strategy. Okay, determining workload requirements. So they expect you to have some general knowledge of a wide variety of IT topics. And so when you're taking one of our learning paths, or specifically taking the AZ301 learning path to prepare for this, we don't cover everything that you need to know for AZ301 because we can't possibly go from the ground up and teach you basically everything there is to know about being an IT professional, right? It covers an incredibly broad range of topics, or it expects you to know these things in order to be able to apply them to Azure. So, as long as you have a reasonable amount of experience in the IT industry, you should be okay. But I just wanted to, make that very clear. What we do focus on in this part of our learning path is on optimizing Azure costs, first of all. So, for example, low priority VMs and reserved VMs are much cheaper than usual. So you need to know when it makes sense to use them. And another example would be, how about the relative costs of different storage tiers, such as hot, cool, and archive? When would you use those? We also covered designing a monitoring strategy. This is something that seems to be very common in the AZ301 sections. It's kind of spread out across all of the sections, this monitoring strategy. But you might think, well, to do monitoring, you would use the service called Azure Monitor. That is useful, but there are actually quite a few different services that they have that all contribute to the monitoring strategy. So there's also application insights, log analytics, Azure Service Health. This is actually a pretty big topic, more than it would seem at first. Okay. Oops, it's not moving. There we go. Okay, designing for identity and security. The focus is on how to use Azure Active Directory. That's the big service in this one. So in a large organization, there are many identities to manage, and this includes not only users, but also applications. So you need to design a proper identity management system. You also need authentication for all of these identities, and that usually includes single sign-on, which is a pretty big topic on its own. So you need to know about things like Azure AD Connect, multi-factor authentication, and privileged identity management. And users and applications also need to be granted the right level of authorization, which is different from authentication, of course. And so for that, you need to use role-based access control, or RBAC. For designing data solutions, Azure includes many different data services, including relational databases such as SQL database, non-relational databases such as Cosmos DB, data warehouses such as SQL Data Warehouse, and data lakes such as Azure Data Lake Storage, and many other related services. So you need to know when to choose each one of these data services, how to size them, and how to design for data protection, availability, consistency, and durability. You also need to know how to design how data flows between the various services. And Tom actually just published a course on data flows recently, and that's in the 301 learning path. All right, designing a business continuity strategy. So the two most important concepts here are high availability and disaster recovery. And as I'm sure you know, high availability is when your services keep running despite failures. So you can design for high availability using various levels of redundancy, such as on Azure, putting multiple VMs in different availability zones. But that's by no means the only way of providing high availability. This is a pretty big topic, and there are lots of different ways to provide redundancy. Disaster recovery, of course, is how you recover from a failure that causes an outage. So here you need to know things like recovery time objective, or RTO, and recovery point objective, or RPO. The most important services that you need to know here are Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup. So for designing for deployment, migration, and integration, this is the smallest section, but it actually still covers a lot. So you need to know how to migrate from an on-premises environment to an Azure environment. Now, considering that there's a service called Azure Migrate, you might think, well, that's mainly what you need to know. But in fact, Azure Migrate doesn't actually migrate anything, oddly enough. You use it to analyze your current on-premises environment, and it helps you plan for the migration, but it doesn't actually do any migrating itself. To do the migration, you use Azure Site Recovery, which is something that I just mentioned for disaster recovery. So it seems kind of weird that the way that you do the migration is using a disaster recovery tool. But in fact, it actually works out pretty well using that. It's a really good tool for migration. You also need to design a repeatable way to deploy Azure resources. And the most obvious tool you need to use in that area is Azure Resource Manager and ARM templates. And then you need to know how to integrate your applications. And the main service that you should know in that area is Azure API Management. For designing an infrastructure strategy, this is where you bring everything together. So you design strategies for storage, compute, and networking, and bring them all together into one comprehensive solution. So you need to know how to choose the right solution, design secure access to the solution, and recommend appropriate management tools. And once again, you need to be able to design a monitoring strategy. That's pretty much the case for everything that we've talked about so far, is you need to know how to monitor everything. All right, so now at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Tom, and Tom is going to give you a quick demo of our learning paths on our site to prepare you for these exams. And there it is. So, Tom.
Thanks, Scott. So on your screen here, you can see the AZ-300 learning path that's available from Cloud Academy. This learning path actually offers over 31 hours of content that can help you prepare for the AZ-300 exam. Now, if we scroll down here just a bit, you can see that it actually consists of roughly 20 different courses, as well as some live labs or hands-on labs. Now, if we scroll down even further, we can see at the very end of the learning path, we actually have an exam here at the end of the learning path that you can use to test your skills with. Now, each of the courses or labs within one of these learning paths focuses on specific skills that need to be mastered to pass the exam. Now, scrolling down again, looking at this exam here, I actually failed this preparation exam while I was preparing for the AZ-300. So I can certainly vouch for the toughness of these particular prep exams. Now, if we click on one of the courses here, what we do is we bring up a page that looks something like this. Now, for example, this is a course on designing for Azure Identity Management that I authored not too long ago. If you look over here on the left-hand side, you'll see here all the different videos that comprise the course. The course itself is actually broken up into several topics that mirror those that I guess covered on the AZ-300 exam. Now, if we mouse over to the learning path navigation here, we can access all different pieces of the learning path so we can access different parts as necessary. If I click on a lab, for example, I'd see a lab screen that opens up somewhat like this. Now, this is a live lab that's included in the AZ-300 learning path. The lab itself is broken up into individual steps that you can see over here on the left-hand side. These labs, what they do is they walk you through the tasks that need to be completed in order to deploy a particular solution that the lab is walking you through. And believe me, these types of hands-on labs are very helpful when preparing for an exam like AZ-300 because you get to actually do the work, which is something you're going to run into when you have to work through a live lab in the exam itself. Now, if we look down here, we have a validate step here. And what this validate step does is it validates or confirms that you've completed all of these steps within the lab correctly. It's a great way to confirm what you've done in the lab itself. I should note, though, that not all labs feature this validation step, so it's not available in every single lab. Now, if we hop over here, I'm going to jump into this tab here. I'll show you what the preparation exam looks like. This is the preparation exam that concludes the AZ-300 learning path. This practice exam essentially prepares you for the type of questions that you'll need to answer on the real exam. This practice exam is also timed like the real exam. So it's going to ask you questions that align with the exam objectives, and it's going to time you just as if you're sitting there taking the real exam. Now, when you've completed this exam, you'll be presented with an overall score as well as some individual section scoring so you can see where you need to brush up. So with that said, let me throw it back over to Guy for some important exam tips.
Okay. Thanks, Tom.
Sure.
All right, just a few tips. So this probably goes without saying, but you should get to the testing center at least 15 minutes before the start time. You can't just walk in and take the exam. There's a procedure you need to go through first, including getting frisked. Well, they don't actually frisk you, but they kind of get you to frisk yourself. They want to make sure that you're not taking any prohibited devices in there that you might cheat with and things like that. So there's a bit of a process, and so make sure that you get there well ahead of time. And then manage your time in the exam. So there's a countdown timer in the exam, which is helpful because they've probably taken away your watch, and there might not be a clock nearby on the wall, so you can always see how much time is left in your exam. But try not to let it, try not to look at it too much, because you can kind of panic when you see the countdown timer going all the time. But where it's really useful is, when you're at a certain point in the exam, you can take a look at how much time is left and how many questions you have left. And so you can get a pretty good idea of whether you're going to get through the exam in time or not, if you need to speed up or not. However, having said that, some of the questions, typically the more time-consuming questions are at the end of the exam, so keep that in mind. You can mark a question for review if it's taking up too much of your time. This is a really handy feature that they have where there's a checkbox that you can check and say, I want to review this later. And so then when you get to the end of the section, it'll say, if you click here to review your questions that you marked, and then it will just take you directly to those questions, so you don't have to go find them again. However, some questions don't allow you to go back. And so I mentioned this already with those true-false scenario questions earlier, but this applies in other places as well. So like once you're done, your case studies, then it won't let you go back and do them again. And so typically the exam is divided into different sections, and you can go and review questions for a particular section, and then when you're done that and you move on, then you can't go back again. So keep that in mind. So what I recommend with the case studies, because they take such a long time to read, and I don't want to give you the wrong impression. It's not like you're reading a novel here or anything, but they do give you a fair amount to read. And so what I usually do is I go through the whole case study quite quickly, just read everything, so I get a basic idea of what it is that they're looking for here without really going over it in great detail. And then as I'm going through the questions will ask about particular parts of the case study. And so then you can go back and read in more detail for those particular parts. And they're actually, Microsoft's pretty helpful with this, where they have headings for the different parts of the case study. So on the left-hand side of your screen, it will show a list of the headings for the case study, so you can just click on the appropriate one. So if you've got a question about, let's say, security, and then they've got a security heading on the left, you can just click on that and read that part in detail without having to kind of go through the whole case study again. Try to relax. I know it can be hard with these tests, but it's usually a lot easier to get through the exam all right if you're relaxed. So you don't have to get a perfect score. You're going to get questions that are quite difficult. You're probably going to get questions wrong, but you don't have to be perfect. The way it works is you need to get 700 out of 1,000 points, which oddly enough does not necessarily mean 70%. So the 700 is what they call a cut score. And what they do is they take a look at how everyone has done on this exam in the past, and then they scale your score kind of against the curve. And so that's why your score doesn't necessarily mean the percent you got right. So it's kind of confusing for them to do it that way. But my point here actually is that, if you get some questions wrong, that's okay. They're expecting you to get some things wrong. And, if you don't happen to pass the exam, you can retake it if you have to. And Microsoft actually has a very liberal retake policy. So, this isn't do or die. You can always take the exam again. So try to relax. All right, so that's all we have prepared. So let's take a look at what questions have come in.
Awesome. Well, thank you to both of you. It's been really great. We do have a couple of questions from our audience. I'll start with the first one. Someone is asking, if I don't pass the exam, how long do I have to wait before I can take it again?
Okay, I'll take that one since I just talked about that. So the first time, if you fail the exam, then you can take it again within 24 hours later. That's as long as you have to wait is just 24 hours. If you need to take it again after that, then you have to wait for another 14 days, and that goes for the subsequent times as well. So just wait 2 weeks, wait 2 weeks. But you can't take a particular exam more than 5 times in 1 year. And I recommend that you check Microsoft's FAQ for certification exams to be sure of what the current policy is, because they could change that. So don't just rely on what I've said here.
Yes, they do tend to change things from time to time, as we've seen. Mm-hmm. Awesome. So let's go to the next one. How in depth are the live labs? How do they work?
Since I just sat the AZ-300, I'll grab this one.
Okay.
The live labs are actually pretty in depth. each live lab that you go through, and I think I had 2, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember. Each one is a multi-part scenario that requires you to actually complete tasks within that tenant, and we talked about that earlier. When you're done completing each task that's necessary to complete part of a solution, there's an option to complete the task. You select you click the button to complete that task. So once you've completed each task for the live lab, and you've selected them all, you've marked them as complete, you can move on to the next one. The interesting thing about the live labs is that you can actually make mistakes before you complete the lab and not be penalized. For example, if you're asked to deploy a specifically named storage account as part of a solution, you can deploy a storage account with maybe like a misspelled name or even the wrong type of storage account, as long as you don't submit that as your answer. So you can actually correct things as you go along until you submit the answer as finalized. So essentially what the exam does is check to make sure that you have the right solution when you've finished the live lab.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that, Tom. Let's move on to the next question. How long will I have to wait to find out if I passed or not?
Okay, so you should receive your score right after the exam. There are some circumstances where that doesn't happen, I think, but whenever I've taken the exams, I've always gotten it right away. That's not the case for beta exams, though. But because these 2 exams aren't in beta anymore, you should find out right away. If you, for whatever reason, if you don't get the results right there at the testing center, then you can go to Microsoft's learning portal, and it should be posted there for you.
Okay. We have actually some other questions coming in regarding the fees for the exams.
Okay.
Sure.
Very generic.
They just want to know how much it costs for the exam?
Yeah.
Okay. So now it actually varies by country. And I think in the US and Canada, it's $165 US. Is that right, Tom?
That is correct.
Yeah. But that's not the case everywhere. I know in some countries it's, I don't know, 99 or something like that. It's in European countries, I think it's in euros, and it's a little bit different. So yeah, it depends where you are, but it should be around that kind of cost.
Okay. How long will I have to wait to find out if sorry, that's not the one that we already asked. Do you have any more recommendations on time management for the AZ-300 exam?
Yeah, Guy, I'll grab this one.
Okay.
Yes, I do. What you're probably going to want to do is move through the multiple choice stuff and the easy stuff, and I'm doing air quotes here that you can't see. Get through that stuff as quickly as you can. What you want to do is save as much time as you can for the live labs, because the live labs can be rough. I mean, if you have 8 or 10 different pieces of information you have to put together for a live lab, you can chew through a lot of time on them. So as far as recommendation goes, is get through the other stuff as quickly as you can and save as much time as you can for the labs.
All right. Let's see what else we have here. Do the hands-on labs use Cloud Academy's Azure account or my own?
So they use a Cloud Academy account. So yeah, just to be clear here, with what Tom was showing you before with the learning paths, when he clicked on a live lab in there, what it does is it gives you an ID and password that you can log in under Cloud Academy's account. So you don't have to pay anything for this yourself. But other than getting the subscription to Cloud Academy. But we actually do have a new feature for enterprises that allows them to run labs in their own Azure subscription if they want to, which not everyone's going to want to do that, right? That means they're going to be incurring their own costs when they do these labs. But for some companies, they would rather do it in their own account than in our account for whatever reason.
All right. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. I think this one is probably for you, Tom. Is it possible to clear the exams without going for labs? What happens if there is a slow connection to Azure Lab setup?
Um, I I wouldn't try to sit this exam without working through some labs. I mean, like I said, the live labs can be really tricky. It really tests your knowledge, and I think Guy alluded to it earlier that early tests, years ago, you could practice with dumps, just practice with concepts, and go and take these exams and pass them. But nowadays, you need to be able to actually use this information, and without working within a lab, you're not going to have that stick time to actually do it. Now, as far as the slow connection to the Azure lab, I'm assuming you're referencing the connection within the exam itself while you're sitting the exam. It's funny that you mention that, because that's similar to what happened to me when I took my AZ-300 just last week. I actually lost probably 10 or 15 minutes of time on my exam because the lab hung up on me in the resource group. So before I knew what was going on, we've already burned 5 or 10 minutes. So what happened is the proctor came in and essentially rebooted the testing workstation. And what he told me during that time is that as long as the machine is turned off, the clock stops on the exam. So after he rebooted it, he restarted, he left, and I ran into the same problem. So he got on the phone with Microsoft, Pearson worked it out, and they fixed whatever they did on the back end. So yeah, if there are problems in the lab, you would talk to the proctor. For me, they rebooted the machine and got everything back to working. But as far as taking the exams without labs, I would not suggest that.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. I am not from .NET background and not much knowledge with coding. Does this exam need .NET or any programming language knowledge?
I think we can both comment on this one probably. You don't need any .NET. As far as coding goes, I mean, they will quite often have, say, PowerShell commands, or they might have some like CLI, command line interface commands, like the Azure SDK. But I don't remember ever seeing any like C# questions or anything like that.
I don't recall seeing any of that either.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have time just for one more question. So here it is. Can we study and go straight to the 301, or how much is the 300 a recommendation before? There's a note though, and my company, they decided to make the 301 mandatory and the 300 is just optional.
I find that really interesting. I'm quite surprised that a company would do that. As far as I know, you can just go and take the 301 without taking the 300 first. I don't think there's any issue with that. I will warn you though that I'm, in my opinion anyway, the 301 is a more difficult exam than the 300, and they cover kind of slightly different things. So, if you just do the 301, you're not going to get the certification for one thing. So in that sense, it seems like a bit of a waste. But I guess if your company is saying, you just need to pass the 301 and you don't need to be certified, and but I'm not going to tell you to take both exams if you don't have to, right? But the 300 covers a lot of things that, if you can get through that one, then do the 301 is what I would normally say. Like the 301 on its own is quite difficult. So, but anyway, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, but basically the answer is, yeah, you can take the 301 all on its own if you really want to.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We'll be kind tonight and today and take another one. They're asking about the prerequisite for the 301, whether the AZ300 is a prerequisite, and someone else is also asking whether as a prerequisite for these exams, a year's cloud experience be enough?
Guy, I could take this. The like Guy just mentioned, there's no the 300 isn't necessarily a prerequisite for 301, at least not either of us is aware of. The more generally speaking, regarding prerequisites for the exams themselves versus cloud experience, I guess it depends on what your cloud experience is. I know for the 301, there are lots of deployment related scenarios and questions that you have to deal with. So if you've been working with VMs, you've been connecting virtual networks, configuring high availability, doing lots of the typical deployment stuff, then a year's worth of cloud experience is probably sufficient. Now, however, if that cloud experience has been more general and not included a whole lot of stick time, then maybe not. So I guess it's a it depends answer, and I hate giving that type of answer, but depending on what you're doing in that year of experience, that's going to drive whether or not you could use that to pass the exam. I don't know, Guy. What are your feelings on it?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here too. In my opinion, you should always do a bit of studying before you take one of these exams. I don't think just the experience is enough, because they ask questions on all kinds of things, and it's actually a bit unlikely for people to have done everything that they have asked about on these exams, especially considering this is an architect exam, right? And so you may not have, if you've been an administrator, basically, then you're probably not, you probably won't have done all of the things that they're going to ask you about in the exam. The range, as I showed you earlier, the range of topics that they cover is just huge. So you pretty much need to do some studying in addition to having the hands-on experience. Having the year of hands-on experience is really good, though. That will help you out tremendously in taking the exam, but you also need to study.
All right. I think that's all the time we have for questions tonight. So thank you to both Guy and Tom for being with us today, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this session. You will receive the recording of the webinar as soon as it is available. If you're looking to prepare for the Microsoft Azure exams or anything cloud related, visit us at cloudacademy.com, where you can also access our previous webinars on demand. So thank you all, and good luck.
See you.